The morning the courier arrived at SHAEF headquarters, the air felt unusually heavy. Officers moved briskly through corridors, their footsteps echoing off concrete walls. But behind the urgency was an unspoken tension. Everyone knew what was coming. Everyone knew what was at stake. A decision had to be made soon, one that would shape the fate of Europe. And the answer, for better or worse, lay inside the sealed envelope delivered to General Dwight D. Eisenhower. He didn't open it immediately. Instead, he dismissed the staff and stood alone for a moment, staring at the packet on his desk. 4 weeks, reconnaissance pilots had risked their lives flying over the French coast, dodging flak and fighter patrols to capture the images now inside that envelope. These photos weren't just intelligence. They were the final puzzle pieces of a colossal gamble called Operation Overlord. Eisenhower finally sat down and slid a finger under the flap. He pulled out the first photograph and unfolded it across the desk. The sight made him freeze. The Normandy coastline stretched across the image like a scar. Jagged rows of anti-tank obstacles, Rommel's asparagus, lined the beaches. Long, angular shadows marked the positions of concrete bunkers carved into bluffs overlooking the shore. Eisenhower leaned in, recognizing gun ports, trenches, minefields, and fortified emplacements. Each one was a death trap waiting for Allied soldiers. He pulled the next set of photos closer. These showed Omaha Beach from a higher altitude. He studied the contours of the cliffs, the narrow exits off the sand, the choke points where German machine gun fire could mow down entire companies. On another sheet, Utah Beach showed fewer defenses, but the marshlands behind it posed their own lethal challenges. For several minutes, the Supreme Commander said nothing. His silence was enough to make the officers waiting outside shift uneasily. Eisenhower's silence was never casual. It always signaled deep calculation. He spread all the photographs across the table, aligning them by sector. His hands moved methodically, tracing possible landing points, identifying vulnerabilities, imagining the chaos of the first waves hitting the shore. He flipped through the intelligence reports attached to the images, estimated troop counts, artillery positions, radar stations. The German defenses were stronger than anticipated. Rommel's improvements to the Atlantic Wall were devastatingly real. Finally, he spoke, but only to himself. Now we know. He didn't say whether that knowledge comforted him or terrified him. It was simply the truth. The door opened quietly as General Walter Bedell Smith entered. He was careful not to interrupt the gravity of the scene. Eisenhower looked up at him, his face firm but the weight of command unmistakable in his eyes. "This," Eisenhower said, gesturing to the photographs, "is the battlefield." Smith stepped forward, scanning the images, and swallowed hard. "It's worse than we expected," he muttered. Eisenhower didn't disagree. He didn't need to. Instead, he folded his arms and stared for a long moment at the coast that would soon be written into history. These photographs were more than reconnaissance. They were a prophecy, a glimpse into a future drenched in fire, steel, and sacrifice. And in that quiet war room, Eisenhower understood that every decision from this moment forward would carry the weight of thousands of lives. The door had barely shut behind General Smith when Eisenhower returned his eyes to the photographs sprawled across the table. The images were cold, clinical, and unyielding. They revealed no mercy, no weakness, only the raw, unforgiving reality of the enemy's defenses. The Atlantic Wall was not a line of fortifications. It was a machine built to kill. An Operation Overlord would be throwing tens of thousands of men directly into its gears. Smith stood silently, watching Eisenhower absorb the full magnitude of what lay before him. It wasn't just the scale of the defenses. It was the precision. Every gun emplacement was positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. Every obstacle forced landing craft into narrow corridors of vulnerability. The German engineers had designed the beaches to be killing grounds before Allied boots even touched the sand. Eisenhower lifted one of the photos again, tilting it toward the lamp to catch finer details. "Look at this," he said quietly. "They've reinforced the western bluffs. That wasn't there last month." Smith leaned closer, and his jaw tightened. The new bunker was larger than the previous structures. Thicker walls, deeper set, more concealed. A perfect vantage point for machine guns or artillery. Eisenhower exhaled sharply. "This changes everything." They were the first clear words he had spoken with certainty since opening the envelope, and they hung in the air like smoke. The phrase wasn't dramatic, it was analytical. precise. Eisenhower was recalculating the invasion in real time, rewriting risk assessments in his mind, reshaping the tactical priorities that would define D-Day. Across the room, a clock ticked steadily, its sound magnified by the tension. Every second felt like another life being added to the weight on Eisenhower's shoulders. He reached for the map on the wall and gestured for Smith to help unroll a larger one. Together they pinned the photos directly onto the map. Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, Sword. Each beach now crowned with its corresponding aerial image. The room transformed into a three-dimensional battlefield. Eisenhower stepped back and crossed his arms. The British can handle Sword and Gold. They have the experience. Juneau will be tough, but the Canadians are disciplined. His voice lowered. But Omaha, the word alone carried the gravity of a funeral bell. Smith nodded grimly. Omaha's a fortress. Eisenhower's gaze lingered on the photo of Omaha Beach, the jagged cliffs, the tiered defenses, the winding draws leading inland. Landing there would mean fighting uphill against entrenched machine gun nests and artillery zeroed in on every approach path. For a brief moment, Eisenhower closed his eyes, not in despair, but in calculation. He saw the battle unfolding. The first wave pinned down, the surf stained red, the radio reports filled with confusion and loss. He knew that history often demanded impossible decisions, but this felt like asking men to charge into fire with the full knowledge that many would not come back. He opened his eyes again, steel returning to his expression. "Get Montgomery in here," he said. "And the air commanders, we're going to need everything. Bombing, naval fire support, deception operations. If we fail to weaken these positions before the landings, we'll be slaughtered." Smith hurried out, leaving Eisenhower alone again with the images. For a moment, the Supreme Commander placed both hands on the table and leaned forward, staring at the photos as if willing them to reveal any weakness. But they did not. They showed only the truth. And now, with these images burned into his mind, Eisenhower understood that D-Day would not just be the largest invasion in history. It would be the most perilous gamble the Allies had ever attempted. When the summons went out, the corridors of SHAEF headquarters filled with hurried footsteps, officers carrying folders, intelligence reports, and maps moved with a sharpness that reflected the urgency of Eisenhower's request. 1, 1, 1. The leading figures of the Allied command arrived outside the war room. General Montgomery with his trademark confidence, Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory with his ever-present reservations, Admiral Bertram Ramsey with the calm authority of a man who had planned invasions before, and a collection of senior planners whose expressions betrayed a growing anxiety. Inside, Eisenhower stood with his back to the door, hands clasped behind him as he stared at the wall-sized map covered with the newly pinned photos of Normandy. The moment the door opened and the commanders filed in, the room seemed to constrict, heavy with the knowledge that something monumental had shifted. Montgomery spoke first. "You asked for us, Ike. What's the situation?" Eisenhower didn't turn around immediately. Instead, he tapped a finger against the largest photo of Omaha Beach. "We have updated aerial reconnaissance. These photos were taken just 48 hours ago." He finally faced him, and even Montgomery's confidence faltered when he saw the gravity in Eisenhower's eyes. Eisenhower began handing out copies of the images. As the commanders studied them, silence spread like frost. Even the sharpest strategists in the room felt the chill of realization. The Germans weren't merely preparing. They were fortifying with a speed and precision that suggested they expected a major landing. The Atlantic Wall had evolved from a defensive line into a modern fortress. Mallory frowned deeply. Those emplacements around Veer, they weren't that extensive in last month's coverage. Admiral Ramsey added, "And look at the mortar pits. Rommel is reinforcing the in-depth coastal batteries. This isn't the same coastline we planned around." Montgomery raised a brow. "It's strong, yes, but nothing we can't soften with sufficient firepower." Eisenhower shook his head. "It's not just the bunkers. Look here. Minefields stretching inland. Tank traps. Log obstacles hidden beneath the waterline. If we miscalculate the tides, landing craft will be ripped apart before troops even reach shore." Ramsey exhaled slowly. "Naval bombardment can clear some of it, but not all. Not the deep fortifications. We'd have to bring the fleet dangerously close. For the first time in the meeting, doubt became palpable. These were men accustomed to making impossible decisions, yet the scale of the challenge staring back at them was larger than any previous estimate. Montgomery stepped forward. "Are you questioning the feasibility of Overlord?" Eisenhower didn't hesitate. "I'm questioning whether we can achieve the necessary breakthrough before German reinforcements arrive. If the first waves are pinned down, the entire invasion could collapse within hours." A cold quiet settled over the room. All eyes fell on the aerial photographs once more. The cliffs casting long shadows, the pillboxes elevated for maximum killing range, the intricate maze of trenches leading inland. "We must adapt," Ramsey finally said. "Change the bombardment timetable. Increase airstrikes. Use deception more aggressively. We still have time." Lee Malari crossed his arms. "And what of casualties? With defenses this severe, our airborne drops could be massacred." Eisenhower let the concerns echo for a moment. Then he stepped forward and placed both hands on the table. "Gentlemen, we are not deciding whether to fight. The invasion is inevitable. What we are deciding is how many men we're prepared to lose in order to win." The room went still. Each commander understood the magnitude of Eisenhower's words. This was no longer theoretical planning. This was the beginning of a countdown to a battle that would define the war and redefine sacrifice. The room fell silent as the next set of reconnaissance photographs slid onto the illuminated table. Unlike the previous broad, sweeping images of terrain and coastline, these were close and comfortably close. High-altitude lenses had captured every bunker, every trench, every shadow that suggested a hidden firing position. And for the first time since arriving at the briefing, Eisenhower leaned forward with visible tension. Before him lay the truth of Normandy, not the hopeful picture of a weakly defended stretch of coastline, but a coastline meticulously prepared for annihilation. Analysts pointed to the first photograph. A long, curved beach section near Vir. At first glance, it looked empty. But the shadows told a very different story. Tilted steel girders, known as Czech hedgehogs, protruded from the sand like rusted claws. Wooden stakes angled toward the sea, many capped with mines, created a lethal forest designed to gut landing craft before they even touched the beach. Eisenhower knew what that meant. The first wave would bleed heavily. A second photograph showed a line of bunkers carved into the cliffs. Some were angled perfectly to sweep the shoreline with machine gun fire. Others housed anti-tank guns, pointed at the very spots where Allied vehicles would have to land. The German engineers had not relied on guesswork. They anticipated Allied tactics with unsettling accuracy. Then came the third image. Eisenhower's jaw tightened. Rows of trenches zigzagged through the grasslands behind the dunes, linking strong points with supply routes and hidden mortar pits. The Germans had created not simple static defenses, but a layered system engineered to absorb, channel, and destroy an advancing army. These were not hastily arranged obstacles. This was architecture. Deadly, deliberate architecture. The intelligence officer speaking paused as he unfurled the next sheet. "Sir, this is the sector we believe will be the heaviest challenge." It was Omaha Beach. In the dim light, the photograph looked like a map of death. The cliffs were riddled with embrasures like serpent eyes. The concrete casemates, some with walls thicker than a battleship's hull, were angled so that their lines of fire overlapped, creating kill zones with no safe passage. Germans had even positioned artillery miles inland, allowing them to fire over the cliffs and onto the beach. For a moment, Eisenhower said nothing. He simply stared. He had commanded armies across continents, but nothing in his career had prepared him for this sight. The perfect expression of German defensive engineering, the Atlantic Wall at full, terrifying strength. The room waited. Finally, Eisenhower exhaled slowly. "Gentlemen, if we go here, the costs will be high, very high. But if these defenses stand when we land, the cost will be immeasurable." Historians would later say that in this moment Eisenhower understood the stakes of Normandy not as a military operation but as a test of human endurance. The beaches were not the targets. They were obstacles designed by Ramillet to break the will of any invading force. But rather than retreat from the specter of German firepower, Eisenhower closed the folder and made his decision crystal clear. "We will beat this wall," he said quietly. or we will die on it. But we will go." The room nodded. The photographs had revealed the danger. Eisenhower had revealed the resolve. The briefing room emptied slowly, but Eisenhower remained seated, eyes fixed on the dim glow of the reconnaissance photographs scattered across the table. Outwardly, he maintained the calm, unshakable posture of a supreme commander. But inside, something far heavier churned. The Atlantic Wall, the monstrous barrier Hitler boasted could withstand anything, was no longer an abstract German project. It was now a living, breathing threat, etched into the fragile silence of those photographs. When the door finally clicked shut, Ike allowed himself a rare moment of vulnerability. Ilian de Bach, rubbing his temples with tired fingers. The room felt colder now, the weight of the decision pressing down as relentlessly as the surf on Normandy's shores. Every obstacle, every bunker, every hidden gun meant lives. Thousands of lives, placed directly in harm's way, he whispered to himself. Almost inaudibly, how many? Not how many Germans. How many of his own men? The Atlantic Wall was not merely a defensive line. It was an engineering marvel built on cruelty and precision. Rommel had transformed the coastline into a machine of destruction, an interlocking system of traps designed to break invaders before they even raised their rifles. Mines buried beneath the dunes, anti-tank rails anchored into concrete, artillery hidden behind false farmhouses, miles of wire, miles of trenches, miles of calculated death. Eisenhower's mind replayed the images like a film reel. The hedgehogs, the stakes, the concrete, the cliffs. He could almost hear the rattling fire of the MG-42s. That would tear through the first wave. He imagined landing craft burning, men tumbling into the cold surf, struggling against the tide as machine guns stitched the water around them. The enormity of it struck him again. This invasion was not just another operation. It was the greatest gamble in modern history. If it failed, Europe would remain in chains. If it failed, he would carry the burden forever. A knock broke the silence. Kay Summersby, his trusted aide, stepped inside quietly. She paused when she saw the look on his face, a rare crack in the armor of the general who carried the hopes of the free world. "General, you should rest," she said softly. Eisenhower shook his head. "I can't," he murmured. "Not with what we just saw." She walked closer, looking at the spread of images. "The men believe in you. They believe you'll lead them to victory." He exhaled slowly. "Belief isn't enough, Kay. Not against that." He pointed to the photograph of Omaha Beach, the one that looked like a blueprint of slaughter. "But that doubt can paralyze a commander," she replied gently. He didn't deny it, because doubt was exactly what he felt. Left alone again, Eisenhower stood, the scene slowly weighing decisions that would shape the outcome of the war. He knew he could not delay the invasion much longer. The moon, tides, and weather all dictated a narrow window, and within that window, he would either defeat Hitler or doom the Allied Expeditionary Force. He looked at the wall of maps and clenched his jaw. "Fear is not an option," he finally whispered. "Not now." He gathered the photographs into a single folder, as if sealing away the dread that had washed over him moments earlier. Whatever fears churned inside him would remain private. The world would see only determination. For Eisenhower understood one truth better than anyone. A commander may fear the battle, but he must never let the battle fear him. The Atlantic Wall had shown its brutality. Eisenhower had felt its shadow. But he also knew, shadows do not stop an army. Only hesitation does, and he would not hesitate. The war room buzzed with tension the moment Eisenhower laid the photographs on the central table. Officers circled them, fingers tracing the contours of Normandy's beaches, eyes widening at the sprawling Atlantic Wall. 4 weeks, strategy had been discussed in abstract terms, maps, grids, and probabilities. Now, the grim reality stared back at them, unyielding and precise, and it struck like a thunderbolt. Chaos erupted. Voices overlapped in a chorus of disbelief. "Impossible," one general muttered, his face pale. This is a fortress, not a coastline." Another shook his head, exhaling sharply. "If the men land here, thousands will fall in minutes. Even the most battle-hardened officers, men who had survived the deserts of North Africa and the frozen plains of Europe, felt the icy fingers of doubt creep into their resolve. Eisenhower's calm voice tried to cut through the cacophony. "Gentlemen, we expected resistance. What we see here is formidable, but not insurmountable." His words, firm yet measured, fell against the walls like an attempt to hold back the tide. Many generals, however, were too entrenched in fear to hear reason. They pointed at bunkers, cliffs, and barbed wire in rapid succession, almost as if speaking them aloud might prevent the invasion. Field Marshal Montgomery, usually confident, leaned over the table and muttered, "We've underestimated the German defenses." Perhaps disastrously so. The phrase carried a weight that silenced the room for a heartbeat. Eisenhower understood the gravity. The Atlantic Wall wasn't just an obstacle, it was a message from Hitler himself. The Reich would not yield, and anyone foolish enough to challenge it would pay in blood. Among the generals, tension manifested in subtle ways. One pounded a fist on the table, frustration flashing in his eyes. Another sat rigidly, jaw clenched, staring into nothing, calculating the inevitable casualties. Quiet murmurs spread, a mixture of shock and fear. Some questioned the feasibility of the landing, while others debated alternative approaches. Yet all agreed there was no escaping the brutal truth. The beach would be a killing field. Eisenhower let them speak, listening carefully, absorbing their perspectives without losing his composure. He knew the fear in the room wasn't just for the mission, it was for the men, and it was real. The photographs had revealed the deadly precision of German engineering, the meticulous layout of defenses, the impossibility of a smooth landing. When the chatter reached a fever pitch, Eisenhower finally spoke again, this time with measured authority. "We will not be paralyzed by what we see. Every fortress can be breached. Every obstacle has a weakness. Our men, our intelligence, our coordination, these are our weapons, and if we wield them wisely, we will succeed." Some generals nodded reluctantly, others remained skeptical, but all recognized the truth. Eisenhower carried the burden of responsibility for decisions no one else could make. He understood the fear, the disbelief, and the chaos. But he also knew that hesitation now would cost far more lives than the risk of action. As the meeting drew to a close, the generals left with heavy hearts, minds racing with calculations of death and strategy. Eisenhower stayed behind, studying the photographs once more. The Atlantic Wall was formidable, terrifying, and lethal. But for the Supreme Commander, fear was not an option. Leadership demanded clarity in the eye of chaos, decisiveness in the shadow of disaster. The generals had seen the horror, Eisenhower had seen the challenge, and in that room, a seed of resolve was planted. A resolve that would carry the Allied forces forward toward the storm of D-Day, no matter the cost. In the quiet moments after the generals had left the war room, Eisenhower remained alone, standing over the photographs of Normandy spread across the table. The room was still, save for the faint hum of the overhead lights and the distant murmur of officers moving in the corridors. For the Supreme Commander, this was a moment of profound reckoning, a silence that weighed heavier than the roar of battle. His eyes traced the jagged cliffs, the reinforced bunkers, the serpentine barbed wire defenses, and the endless stretches of sand where thousands of Allied soldiers would soon land. He could almost hear the whistling of German bullets, the roar of artillery, the screams that would pierce the dawn. This was not a simulation. These was real, and the stakes could not have been higher. Eisenhower's mind moved in precise, ruthless calculations. He considered troop deployments, naval firepower, paratrooper drops, air bombardments, and the fragile window of timing that could mean victory or catastrophic failure. Each detail, each variable, each human life weighed on him with acute intensity. He knew that even a minor miscalculation could turn the operation into a disaster that would alter the course of the war. The thought struck him, if the invasion failed, the entire Allied strategy in Europe could collapse. Hitler's forces would consolidate. Morale in occupied territories would falter, and the Soviet Union, bearing the brunt of the Eastern Front, could face unimaginable pressure without the relief of a second front. The consequences were staggering. Failure here was not just a tactical setback. It was a pivot upon which the fate of nations hung. Yet, Eisenhower, did not allow despair to cloud his judgment. He had spent years honing his capacity for measured decision-making under extreme pressure. The photographs before him were terrifying, but they were also tools, blueprints for planning, for exploiting weaknesses, for orchestrating a calculated strike that could pierce even the Atlantic Wall. Every line, every bunker, every beach became part of a mental map, a strategy only he could fully visualize. In the depths of his thoughts, he whispered quietly to himself, "If we fail, the war changes forever." The words were not meant for anyone else. They were an acknowledgement of the immense weight on his shoulders, a solitary confession that the lives of thousands rested on his ability to make the right decisions. There was no room for error, no margin for hesitation, and no time for doubt. Hours passed as he reviewed intelligence reports, cross-referenced aerial photographs, and recalculated probabilities. He thought of the men who would follow orders, who trusted in his leadership to carry them through the storm. Their courage demanded that he rise above fear, that he transform anxiety into clarity, that he convert uncertainty into action. Eisenhower understood that leadership in war was not measured by the absence of fear, but by the ability to act decisively in its presence. He silently vowed that every decision, every command, every strategy would be executed with the utmost precision. Failure was not an option, not because of hubris, but because the stakes were too monumental, the consequences too grave. As dawn approached, Eisenhower finally allowed himself a moment to exhale. The images of Normandy remained, a haunting reminder of what was to come. Yet within the weight of those photographs lay the path forward, the outline of a plan that could turn the tide of history. Alone in the war room, he made a silent promise to the world. Whatever the cost, D-Day would proceed. The generals would see the chaos. The men would face the storm. And Eisenhower, with every calculation, every sleepless night, and every grave responsibility, would ensure that history did not falter under the weight of fear. For the Supreme Commander, silence was not indecision. It was the calm before action, the prelude to one of the most decisive operations the world had ever witnessed. The early hours of June 1944 were steeped in tension. Yet, in the dimly lit war room at SHAEF headquarters, a sense of grim determination prevailed. Eisenhower, surrounded by maps, aerial photographs, and stacks of intelligence reports, faced the culmination of months of meticulous planning. Every detail of the impending invasion had been scrutinized, debated, and refined. Yet the ultimate question remained. When, precisely, would the Allies strike? For weeks, meteorologists had warned of unpredictable storms, and naval officers fretted over tides, currents, and the challenge of landing thousands of troops on heavily defended beaches. Eisenhower weighed the counsel of his generals, each offering their perspective, each voicing their concerns, yet none could shoulder the responsibility of the final call. That burden, that single defining decision, rested entirely upon him. He studied aerial photographs once more. Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, and Sword beaches stretched before him, revealing the deadly reality of the Atlantic Wall. Pillboxes bristling with machine guns, hidden artillery emplacements, and minefields poised to shred the invading forces. Intelligence indicated the Germans were alert, yet the element of surprise still offered a slender hope. Time was both an ally and an enemy. Delay could provide better weather, but it could also allow the enemy to reinforce their positions. Eisenhower's mind raced through every scenario. He envisioned the paratroopers dropping behind enemy lines, the bombardments attempting to weaken German fortifications, and the amphibious assaults that would carry thousands of soldiers into the jaws of enemy fire. Each calculation carried weight. Failure here was not just a tactical error. It could extend the war by years, cost countless lives, and alter the political landscape of Europe forever. In a moment of rare vulnerability, Eisenhower stepped away from the maps and gazed out the window, contemplating the men who would soon step into history. Their courage, their discipline, their unwavering trust in their commanders. It all depended on the precision of his decision. He understood that leadership in war was as much about timing as strategy. The wrong day, the wrong tide, the wrong wind could transform a meticulously planned operation into a catastrophe. He recalled the counsel of his advisors, the meteorological reports, and the intelligence briefings from French resistance agents. With each piece of information, the decision became clearer, yet the enormity of responsibility never diminished. he realized that choosing the day of invasion was not merely a logistical calculation. It was a moral act, a solemn judgment on the lives of thousands and the fate of an entire continent. Finally, Eisenhower made his choice. He would launch the invasion on June 6th. 1944. The decision was not taken lightly. It was the product of relentless analysis, instinct honed by years of command, and an unyielding commitment to duty. He drafted a brief message to the troops, a simple yet profound declaration of resolve. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. As he signed the order, Eisenhower understood the magnitude of the moment. D-Day would commence not as a gamble, but as the calculated execution of months of preparation, intelligence gathering, and strategic planning. Every commander, every soldier, and every ship and plane depended upon the clarity of his choice. History would judge not only the outcome of the invasion, but the wisdom and courage of the man who dared to decide when the world held its breath. In that quiet war room, amid maps and photographs, Eisenhower's decision crystallized. June 6th was no longer just a date. It was the fulcrum upon which the liberation of Europe would pivot. The fate of nations, the lives of millions, and the course of history were now intertwined with a single, monumental choice. The countdown to today had begun. The night before the largest amphibious invasion in history, SHAEF headquarters was cloaked in tense silence. War rooms hummed with the low murmur of radios and the shuffle of papers. Before General Dwight D. Eisenhower, there was only one task left: to speak directly to the men who would carry the burden of D-Day on their shoulders. Every commanding officer, from the naval admirals coordinating the armada to the generals leading the landings, awaited the message that would crystallize the weight of the coming hours. Eisenhower's pen hovered over a sheet of paper, the ink barely touching the page. The enormity of his responsibility pressed upon him. He was not writing a tactical briefing, nor a motivational speech. He was offering a moral compass, a declaration of resolve, and a final reassurance to those who would lead men into the crucible of war. Each word had to carry clarity, authority, and an unshakable faith in their courage and judgment. In the quiet of his office, Eisenhower reflected on the journey that had brought the Allies to this precipice. The meticulous planning, the countless simulations, the intelligence from resistance fighters, and the painstaking coordination of air, sea, and land forces. All of it culminated in the dawning hours of June 6th. He understood that in the hands of his commanders rested not just soldiers, but the hopes of a continent yearning to be free from tyranny. The message he drafted was both stark and inspiring. He acknowledged the gravity of the task, the risk of failure, and the possibility of great sacrifice. Yet he also affirmed his unwavering confidence in their skill, discipline, and resolve. "You are about to embark upon the great crusade," he wrote. "A crusade in which the eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people march with you. Your courage, your determination, and your steadfastness will determine the fate of not only this war, but the freedom of nations under tyranny." Eisenhower's words were more than a call to action. They were a moral anchor. He reminded his commanders that they were not acting in isolation, but as part of a global effort, bound by shared purpose and trust. He invoked the memory of those who had fallen in previous battles, the millions who suffered under occupation, and the generations yet unborn who would inherit the world forged by their valor. Every sentence carried the weight of history, the responsibility of command, and the hope of liberation. As he finalized the message, Eisenhower understood its dual purpose. It was meant to embolden his commanders, to instill courage in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles, and to provide clarity amidst the chaos of war. The Atlantic lay dark and foreboding. The beaches of Normandy awaited, and yet, in the quiet of that night, the resolve of the Allied leadership was absolute. He dispatched the message with his signature calm authority, aware that its impact would resonate across the command structure. Generals and admirals read his words, internalized them, and prepared their men for the dawn that would bring both peril and opportunity. The gravity of their mission was tempered by Eisenhower's confidence, his unwavering belief in their judgment, and his recognition of the moral imperative that guided every decision. When the last courier had departed and the message had reached every key commander, Eisenhower remained alone with his thoughts. The storm that would soon sweep across the beaches of Normandy was imminent. Yet in the quiet of that night, amid maps and dispatches, he had done all he could to prepare his leaders, not just tactically, but morally, for the moment when the world would watch and history would be written in courage, sacrifice, and the unyielding pursuit of freedom. The final words were no longer ink on paper. They were a promise, a command, and a testament. The storm was coming, but the men of D-Day now carried Eisenhower's conviction in their hearts. The countdown to history's most daring assault had entered its final hours. In the dim light of SHAEF headquarters, the walls were lined with maps, sketches, and countless intelligence reports. But it was the aerial photographs, black and white snapshots of the Normandy coastline, that captured the attention of every strategist, officer, and planner in the room. Each image was a frozen moment, a piece of truth revealing the defenses of the Atlantic Wall, the strength of German fortifications, and the geography of the beaches where the fate of Europe would soon be decided. Eisenhower stared at the photographs, tracing the hedgerows, cliffs, and sand dunes, with a finger that trembled slightly, not from fear but from the weight of responsibility. These images told a story that no briefing or report could fully convey. They revealed the scale of the challenge, the ingenuity of the German defenses, and the risks awaiting the men who would storm the beaches at dawn. From the vantage of the air, the dangers of Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juneau, and Sword beaches were starkly evident. Minefields, artillery emplacements, machine gun nests, and obstacles that threatened to decimate the landing forces before they even reached the shore. But beyond the tactical details, the photographs also shaped the strategy, forcing Eisenhower and his generals to adapt plans in real time. The images revealed hidden sandbars that could trap landing craft, the exact locations of German gun batteries, and the limited avenues of approach through the cliffs and hedgerows. Engineers and planners pored over the photographs, identifying landing zones and safe corridors, deciding where amphibious tanks should be deployed, and recalibrating artillery bombardments to maximize impact while minimizing Allied casualties. Each photograph became a point of discussion in the war room. Commanders debated relentlessly, cross-referencing aerial images with intelligence from French resistance fighters and reconnaissance teams. The images brought the abstract plans to life, converting hypothetical scenarios into tangible threats and opportunities. Eisenhower, ever the decisive leader, absorbed every detail, weighing the potential costs against the overarching necessity of liberating Western Europe. These photographs were not merely pictures. They were the instruments that molded strategy, morale, and determination. Among the images, some showed subtle changes along the coast, newly erected defenses, camouflaged artillery, and signs of German troop movements. These insights forced adjustments in timing, sequencing, and coordination of the invasion. The intelligence gathered from the skies transformed the planning process from theoretical to actionable, guiding decisions about the placement of paratroopers, naval bombardments, and aerial support. Every pixel of contrast in the photographs carried life-or-death consequences for thousands of men about to step onto enemy soil. Yet, there was also a psychological dimension. For Eisenhower, the photographs were a sobering reminder of the immense courage required of the soldiers under his command. They crystallized the stakes, showing him precisely what awaited the Allied forces and how unrelenting the German defense would be. But they also galvanized resolve. If the enemy's strength could be seen, it could also be confronted, countered, and ultimately overcome. By dawn on June 6th, these aerial images had been studied, analyzed, and integrated into a meticulously coordinated plan of attack. They had informed the placement of landing craft, the timing of bombardments, and the sequence of airborne drops behind enemy lines. More than maps or written reports, these photographs had shaped Operation Overlord itself, giving commanders the insight needed to make split-second decisions under fire. History would remember the bravery, the strategy, and the sacrifice of D-Day. But it was in those photographs, silent, monochrome, and unyielding, that the first true vision of victory was captured. They transformed uncertainty into action, fear into preparation, and chaos into a plan. In every dark room where images were developed, in every command tent where maps were marked, and in the mind of Eisenhower himself, the fate of Europe was being decided one photograph at a time. When the first landing craft hit the Normandy sands, The world would witness the culmination of years of planning, countless sacrifices, and the guidance of a single clear-eyed general who had seen it all in the stark clarity of aerial photographs. In those images lay both the danger and the promise, a visual testament to the intelligence, courage, and determination that made Operation Overlord possible.